That was Tommy Lasorda, baseball legend and Hall of Fame manager, absolutely losing his mind over Dave Kingman. This was not some quiet locker room complaint. This was not a measured post-game analysis where a disappointed manager talks about what went wrong. This was a public meltdown for the ages, caught on tape, dripping with rage and disbelief. The frustration was raw and unfiltered. Lasorda was not alone in his fury. Kingman was a player who somehow hit 442 home runs in his career and still ended up being hated by nearly everyone who ever met him. How does that happen? How does a man with that much raw power, that much pure ability to change a game with one swing become baseball's most toxic personality? How does someone who should be celebrated as a legend become a cautionary tale instead? Dave Kingman stood at 6 feet 6 inches tall and weighed 210 pounds. In an era when the average baseball player was considerably smaller, Kingman looked like he had been genetically engineered in a laboratory to hit baseballs into orbit. They called him King Kong and Sky King, because when he swung the bat, the ball did not just leave the park. It disappeared into another dimension. It shattered windows in apartment buildings across the street. It dented cars in parking lots that should have been safe. It created legends that grew with each retelling. At the time he retired, only 18 other players in the entire history of Major League Baseball had hit more home runs than him. Think about that for a second. In over a century of professional baseball, only 18 men had hit more home runs. He was tied for 4th all-time in career grand slams with 16, sharing that record with Babe Ruth and Hank Aaron. When you are mentioned in the same sentence as Babe Ruth and Hank Aaron, you are doing something right. He averaged 1 home run every 15-11 at-bats, which ranked as the 19th best rate in history when he hung up his cleats. He was a 3-time All-Star, a 2-time National League home run leader, and he finished in the top 25 of MVP voting 5 separate times. These are not the numbers of some scrub who barely made it in the league. These are not the statistics of a journeyman who hung around because he could hit a little. These are the credentials of a generational slugger, a man whose ability to change a game with one swing was virtually unmatched in his era. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. Here is where the paradox begins. Kingman hit just 236 for his career. That is not just below average, that is terrible. That is the kind of batting average that gets minor leaguers sent back down to AAA. His on-base percentage was a dismal .302, lower than utility infielders who barely saw playing time, lower than guys whose entire job was to sit on the bench and occasionally pinch run. He struck out 1,816 times, which was the 4th highest total in MLB history when he retired. He was swinging and missing more than almost anyone who had ever played the game. He was described by people who watched him play every day as an atrocious fielder, someone who actively hurt his team when the ball was not in the air, heading toward the seats. Fly balls would drop around him. Ground balls would roll through his legs. Throws would sail over his head. He was the textbook definition of an all-or-nothing player, decades before the 3 true outcomes era made it acceptable. He hit home runs, he struck out, and he fielded poorly. In an era that valued situational hitting and all-around play, this was not seen as a specialized skill set. It was seen as incomplete and deeply flawed. But his statistics, as extreme as they were, are not why Dave Kingman is remembered so negatively. Plenty of players have had weird statistical profiles. Plenty of sluggers have struck out too much or could not field their position. He is reviled because his one-dimensional play was matched by a one-dimensional, toxic personality. His character destroyed his career. His attitude poisoned every clubhouse he entered. His behavior alienated every teammate he ever had. What follows is the story of a man who destroyed every relationship he ever had in baseball and ended his career not because he could not hit anymore, not because his skills had diminished, but because nobody could stand to be around him. Because the psychological cost of having Dave Kingman on your team outweighed the value of those 35 home runs he could still hit. Bill Caudle was a pitcher for the Chicago Cubs who played with Kingman in the late 1970s. Caudle was not known as a malcontent or a complainer. He was a professional who understood the game and understood that not everyone gets along. But when he talked about Kingman, something different came through, a real frustration, a real pain. Caudle said, Dave Kingman was like a cavity that made your whole mouth sore. Think about that metaphor for a second. Really think about it. A cavity is a small spot of decay, a localized problem. You get a cavity in one tooth. It is annoying. It hurts when you drink something cold, but an untreated cavity does not stay localized. The decay spreads. The infection radiates. The pain moves from that one spot to your entire jaw to your whole mouth until everything is sore and nothing feels right. That is what Caudle was saying about Kingman. His defensive lapses, his atrocious fielding, his sullen aloofness, these were not just personal issues that he kept to himself. They were infections that spread to the entire clubhouse. When Kingman booted a ground ball, it was not just an error. It deflated the pitcher who had worked so hard to get that ground ball. When Kingman struck out with runners in scoring position, it was not just a failed at bat, it sucked the energy out of the dugout. When Kingman sat in front of his locker refusing to talk to anyone, grunting when spoken to, It created a toxic atmosphere that made everyone uncomfortable. His bad vibes destroyed team morale and made the daily grind of an MLB season unbearable for everyone around him. He was not just a hole in the lineup, he was an infection in the locker room, a disease that could not be cured, a cavity that made your whole mouth sore. John Stearns was a catcher for the New York Mets and another teammate who had to deal with Kingman up close. Stearns famously said that Kingman had the personality of a tree trunk. When asked to elaborate to explain what he meant by that bizarre comparison, Stearns said he's not a bad guy, but if you try to talk to him, about all he does is grunt. Imagine that for a second. You are a professional athlete. You spend 8 months a year traveling with these guys, sitting next to them on planes, eating meals with them, celebrating wins and mourning losses together. Baseball is a team sport. It requires communication. It requires trust. It requires some basic level of human connection. And one of your teammates has the personality of a tree trunk. He does not talk. He does not engage. He does not participate in the most basic social rituals that make a team function. He grunts. What makes this quote so important is that Stearns also praised Kingman's power. In the same 1979 Sports Illustrated interview, Stearns said that power-wise, Dave is in a class by himself. He's frightening. So his teammates were not blind to his talent. They were not jealous or resentful. They were in awe of it. They understood that what Kingman could do with a baseball bat was special, maybe even historic. But that respect was a one-way street. Kingman did not respect them back. The tree trunk who only grunted was incapable or unwilling to participate in the most basic social contract of a team. In the highly communicative and interdependent environment of a professional clubhouse, this level of detachment is a form of sabotage. It signals a complete disinterest in the collective. It tells your teammates that you do not care about them, that you are only there for yourself, that their success or failure means nothing to you. This explains why he played for 7 different franchises in 16 years. 7 teams in 16 years? That is almost a new team every other year. That is not normal. That is not the career arc of a respected veteran or a valued teammate. That is the pattern of someone who burns bridges everywhere he goes. No team, regardless of how many home runs he hit, was willing to endure his presence for long. If you're starting to see a pattern here of a guy who just couldn't get along with anyone, make sure you drop a comment below and hit that subscribe button. We're just getting started on this story, and it gets so much worse. Kingman's toxicity was not limited to passive-aggressive detachment. He was not just a silent presence who made people uncomfortable. He was also a source of active antagonism, a player who openly defied his own managers and drove his opponents to historic levels of public frustration. In 1983, Kingman was back with the New York Mets for his second stint with the team. He had arrived after a controversy-plagued tenure with the Cubs and initially presented himself as a changed man. He talked to reporters. He said all the right things about being a team player and learning from past mistakes. Under manager Joe Torre in the strike-shortened 1981 season, he was a model citizen, hitting 22 home runs and even agreeing to meet with reporters on a regular basis. People thought maybe, just maybe, Kingman had finally grown up. Maybe he had learned that talent alone was not enough. Maybe he understood that professional sports required more than just hitting home runs. But this did not last. Of course it did not last. In 1982, he won his second home run title with 37, but he did so while hitting just 204, the lowest batting average by any home run champion in baseball history. Let that sink in. The lowest batting average by any home run champion ever. He was so bad at everything else that even while leading the league in the most celebrated offensive category, he was still a liability. This abysmal average made him a defensive and offensive liability against right-handed pitching. And by 1983, the Mets had acquired first baseman Keith Hernandez, one of the best all-around players in baseball. With Hernandez at first base, Kingman was a man without a position. Under interim manager Frank Howard, Kingman was platooned against left-handed pitching. This was not a punishment. This was not a demotion. This was a logical, data-driven managerial decision meant to protect him from his weaknesses and maximize his effectiveness. The numbers showed he could not hit right-handers. The numbers showed he was getting destroyed. So the manager made the smart decision to only play him when he had a chance to succeed. Kingman's response was pure insubordination. He threatened to bunt every time he faced a left-handed pitcher to protest the decision. A bunt. Dave Kingman threatening to bunt. Think about what that means. A bunt is the antithesis of everything Kingman represented. A bunt is a sacrifice. A bunt is a team first play. A bunt requires speed and agility and skills that Kingman did not have. He was the first overall pick in the 1970 draft, a man paid to hit 442 home runs over his career. For him to threaten to bunt was not a strategic choice to help the team. It was not an attempt to adapt his game. It was a calculated, passive-aggressive act of malice. He was effectively telling his manager, "You are trying to help me. You are trying to optimize my performance by protecting me from my weaknesses. So I will deliberately perform in a way that is maximally useless to you. I will sabotage not just myself, but the entire team because my ego cannot handle a reduced role." It is the ultimate act of a wasted talent. Choosing to sabotage his own team rather than accept a reduced but more effective role, it is the choice of a child throwing a tantrum, not a professional athlete trying to win games. He was released after the season. The Mets, a team desperate for power, a team that could have used those home runs, decided they would rather have nobody than have Dave Kingman. That tells you everything you need to know. If his own managers fumed in private, his effect on opponents was a matter of public record. The most famous example occurred on May 14, 1978, a date that lives in infamy for anyone who cares about baseball history. On that day, Kingman's Chicago Cubs faced Tommy Lasorda's Los Angeles Dodgers at Dodger Stadium. It was a warm California afternoon. The Dodgers were a good team, a well-coached team, a team built on fundamentals and smart baseball. And for one afternoon, none of that mattered. For one afternoon, Dave Kingman was the most destructive force in baseball. He hit 3 home runs against the Dodgers. Not just any home runs. Massive, towering shots that seemed to defy physics. His final home run was a game-winning 3-run shot in the top of the 15th inning. A ball that traveled so far that fans were still talking about it decades later. Kingman personally drove in 8 of the Cubs' 10 runs in a 10-7 victory. One man. 8 runs batted in. In a 15-inning game, he was the entire offense. Following the loss, KLAC radio reporter Paul Olden approached Lasorda in the hallway and asked what seemed like a standard, if somewhat lazy, post-game question. "What's your opinion of Kingman's performance?" Olden probably expected a measured response, maybe some frustration mixed with grudging respect. What he got instead has become one of the most infamous tirades in sports history. Lasorda's response was volcanic. "What's my opinion of Kingman's performance? What the bleep do you think is my opinion of it? I think it was bleeping horseshit. Put that in. Put that in your bleeping story. I don't bleeping opinion of his performance. Jesus Christ, he beat us with 3 bleeping home runs. 3 bleeping home runs. What the bleep do you mean, what is my opinion of his performance? How could you ask me that question like that? How could you stand there and ask me that?" The rant went on. It kept going. Lasorda could not stop. The profanity flowed, the anger built, and then, just as suddenly as it started, it ended. The rage broke like a fever. Lasorda took a breath and his voice changed. "I mean, he put on a hell of a show," he conceded, almost quietly. "He hit 3 home runs. He drove in, what, 7 runs? 8 runs? So what the hell more can you say about him? What else is there to say?" The rant is famous for its profanity, but the subtext is what is truly revealing. Lasorda's explosion was not just the anger of a manager who lost a game. Managers lose games all the time. This was something deeper. This was the incredulous rage of a baseball purist whose entire strategic world had been upended by a player he viewed as a one-dimensional fluke. To Lasorda, baseball was a game of fundamentals, teamwork, and strategy. You moved runners over, you executed the hit and run, you played sound defense, you did all the little things that add up over 162 games. Kingman was an affront to all of it. He was a tree trunk who did not run. He did not field, he did not think, he just hit. And somehow, impossibly, that was enough. That this all-or-nothing player could single-handedly, almost accidentally, destroy a real baseball team like the Dodgers was not just a loss. It was an insult to the game itself. It was a mockery of everything Lasorda believed in. The rant was not just anger, it was incredulity. It was the sound of a man trying to process the absurd, trying to make sense of a world where Dave Kingman could be a hero. And in the end, even Lasorda had to admit it. He put on a hell of a show, because even Tommy Lasorda, even a man who hated everything Kingman represented, could not deny the raw power of what had just happened. But if you think that is as bizarre as Kingman's career gets, you have not heard about the Metrodome roof incident. This story sounds like fiction. It sounds like something a writer would make up to symbolize a player's career. But it really happened. On May 4th, 1984, Kingman, now with the Oakland A's, was at Minneapolis to face the Minnesota Twins at the Hubert H. Humphrey Metrodome. The Metrodome was an architectural disaster, a stadium with a fabric roof held up by air pressure. It was loud. It was weird. It was the kind of place where strange things happened. In the 4th inning, Kingman came to bat against pitcher Frank Viola, who would go on to win a Cy Young Award. Viola threw a pitch. Kingman swung. And what happened next defied all logic and reason. He hit a pop-up over second base, a high, lazy fly ball, the kind of pop-up that happens hundreds of times in every baseball season. Infielders converged. They waited for the ball to come down. They waited. And waited. And the ball never came down. Kingman skied a pop-up over second base, and the ball apparently went into a hole in the fabric ceiling. one of the 8-inch drainage holes 180 feet above the field. The ball just vanished. As the Associated Press reported with barely concealed amazement, Kingman proved tonight that whatever goes up does not necessarily come down. The disappearing ball paralyzed the game. Umpires stood around looking at each other. Players stood around looking at the umpires. Nobody knew what to do. There was no rule in the book for such an event. How could there be? How do you plan for a ball that goes up but never comes down? None of the umpires knew what to do next, and in the vacuum created by this absurdity, chaos reigned. Into this chaos stepped Twins first baseman Mickey Hatcher, a player known for his sense of humor and his willingness to do whatever it took to win. Hatcher saw an opportunity. He saw that the umpires were confused, that nobody knew what was happening, and he decided to take matters into his own hands. Hatcher stole a ball from the umpire's bag. He grabbed it when nobody was looking. In a piece of brilliant baseball theater, he slammed it against the ground, pretending it had fallen from the roof. He then ran over and tagged Kingman out with the stolen fake ball. He sold it hard. He acted like he had just made a routine catch. It was a brilliant piece of performance art, a moment of creativity in response to absurdity. But the umpires were not fooled. They did not go for it. They huddled, they discussed. And after a long delay that felt like an eternity, Kingman was awarded a ground rule double. This entire event is a perfect metaphor for Kingman's career. Think about the symbolism. Kingman, a player who operated outside the unwritten rules of baseball, outside the norms of teamwork and hustle and character, hits a ball that literally breaks the physical rules of the game. The ball goes up but does not come down. It violates the laws of physics, or at least the laws of baseball. This Kingman event creates total chaos and paralyzes the arbiters of order, the umpires who are supposed to maintain control. In response, a normal player, Mickey Hatcher, a guy who represents everything Kingman is not, has to resort to an equally absurd, chaotic, and outside-the-rules action just to cope. He has to steal a ball and fake an out because the normal procedures of baseball have been shattered by Kingman's presence. The incident, while comical on the surface, symbolizes the Kingman effect perfectly. His mere presence could warp the fabric of the game, forcing everyone around him into absurdity, into chaos, into a world where the normal rules no longer applied. If the roof incident was Kingman's most bizarre act, the rat incident was his most infamous. This was not a moment of on-field chaos. This was not an accident or a moment of weird luck. This was a premeditated act of disrespect, misogyny, and professional self-destruction. It was the moment Kingman's toxicity became so undeniable, so public, so impossible to ignore that it ended his career despite his elite production. The incident occurred on June 23, 1986 in Kansas City. The target was Susan Fornoff, who was covering the Oakland A's for the Sacramento Bee. Fornoff was one of the pioneers of women sports writers, one of the brave women fighting for access and respect in a hostile, male-dominated environment. The 1980s were not that long ago, but they were a different world. Women reporters faced harassment constantly. They were told they did not belong. They were told to go back to writing about fashion or cooking. They had to fight for every interview, every quote, every basic right that male reporters took for granted. And Dave Kingman was the primary source of that hostility. This was not an isolated incident. This was not one bad joke that went wrong. Kingman had a history of media abuse that went back years. He had previously dumped a bucket of ice water on reporter Dawn Friska for asking a question he did not like. He had explicitly told Fornoff to her face that women do not belong in the clubhouse. He did not say it quietly. He did not say it as a joke. He said it as a statement of fact, as a warning, as a threat. Fornoff later wrote that Kingman had harassed her since she began covering the beat in 1985. He regularly belittled me with vicious comments, she wrote. He would refuse to talk to other reporters as long as she was present. He turned her into a pariah in her own workplace. He made it impossible for her to do her job. And this went on for over a year before the rat incident happened. On that day in June, a press box guard delivered a pink box to Fornoff. It looked like a gift. It was wrapped nicely. It had tissue paper. As she recounted later, inside, the tissue paper rustled. Something in the box was alive. Can you imagine that moment? Can you imagine opening what you think is a gift and realizing that something inside is moving? Security was called. They investigated. They carefully opened the box. Inside was a live rat, not a toy rat, not a fake rat, a real live rat. And attached to the rat was a tag that read, "My name is Sue." It was cruel. It was calculated. It was designed to humiliate and terrorize. Kingman's reaction to this very public display of sexual harassment was not an apology. It was not remorse. It was defiant justification. He was hardly contrite. He dismissed the act as a harmless practical joke. He claimed, "You know me, I'm a practical jokester. That's my track record," as if sending a live rat to a woman who you have been harassing for over a year is just a joke, as if terrorizing someone in their workplace is just good fun. He then doubled down on the misogyny that motivated the act. He issued a chilling statement that revealed his true character. "This is a man's clubhouse," he said. "If someone can't take a simple joke, they shouldn't be in the game. Pure and simple, if you can't take it, move out." And just to make sure everyone knew he had no regrets, Kingman pinned letters of support he received after the incident around his locker. Fan mail from people who agreed with him, who thought he had done the right thing. He displayed them proudly like trophies. This was the moment Kingman's character finally and irrevocably voided his talent. The career consequences were direct and immediate. The A's, then owned by Walter Haas and Roy Eisenhardt, who were considered better businessmen than most team owners, fined Kingman $3,500. But more importantly, they warned him that if an incident of a similar nature occurs in the future, he will be released immediately. It was a final warning. One more incident, and you are done. Kingman finished the 1986 season with 35 home runs and 100 RBI. Read those numbers again. 35 home runs, 100 RBI. These were elite bankable numbers. These were numbers that teams would pay millions of dollars for. These were numbers that should have guaranteed him another contract, another chance, another season. But when his contract expired after the season, Oakland did not renew it. They just let him walk. His last MLB appearance was October 5th, 1986. He was 38 years old. He could still hit, but nobody wanted him. Some people say Kingman was blackballed. Some people claim he was a victim of owner collusion, that the teams conspired together to keep him out of baseball. But Susan Fornoff's own account provides the real explanation, the more precise and damning truth. The A's quietly ignored his contract. While his new manager, Tony La Russa, may have wanted his bat back, may have wanted those 35 home runs in his lineup, the A's ownership had their own reasons for dropping him. The rat incident was that reason. He had hit 35 home runs, but he was no longer just a cavity or a tree trunk. He was a disruptive, unrepentant, misogynistic liability. He was a public relations nightmare. He was someone whose presence would drive away fans, drive away sponsors, drive away anyone with a sense of decency. The A's chose to move on. They signed future Hall of Famer Reggie Jackson for his final season, bringing in a legendary name who could still contribute. And they invested in the new blood of Jose Canseco and Mark McGwire, two young sluggers who would go on to revolutionize the power game. Kingman had made himself unemployable. The rat incident was not a practical joke. It was an act of career suicide. The final piece of this toxic legacy is best told through the lens of Mike Schmidt. From the moment they entered the league, the two were inextricably linked as the premier power whiffers of their generation. They were the two guys everyone talked about when discussing power and strikeouts. They were compared constantly. Their statistics were analyzed side by side. Their careers followed parallel tracks. But their parallel careers serve as the ultimate object lesson in the difference between a one-dimensional journeyman and a complete player. As early as May 1976, Sports Illustrated ran a profile on the pair titled, "It's either a cloud or an out," defining them by their shared hit or miss proposition. Both hit for power. Both struck out a lot. But even then, even at the very beginning, the difference in their character and approach to the game was stark. Kingman was described as less analytical, with an awkward batting style like a very tall man falling from a very short tree. He did not study pitchers. He did not make adjustments. He just swung hard and hoped. He was more realistic, admitting, "I don't think I'll ever hit for average." His goal was simply to hit homers. That was it. That was his entire approach to baseball. Hit the ball as far as possible and let everything else take care of itself. Schmidt was already seen as more controlled, a better all-around player. He was deeply analytical and critical of his own flaws. He watched film. He studied scouting reports. He worked with hitting coaches. He was a frustrated singles hitter who aspired to bat 340 some year and become a good, intimidating hitter. Not just a dangerous one. He wanted to be complete. He wanted to be great at everything, not just one thing. The wasted talent narrative was not a historical revision written years later. It was being written in real time in 1976, when both players were still in their prime. Kingman was content to be one-dimensional. Schmidt aspired to be complete, and that made all the difference. A single game on May 17, 1979 serves as a perfect metaphor for their entire careers. On that day, the Philadelphia Phillies and Chicago Cubs played one of the most absurd games in baseball history. The final score was 23-22. The wind was blowing out at Wrigley Field. Pitchers were getting destroyed. Both teams were hitting everything. And in the middle of this chaos, both Dave Kingman and Mike Schmidt put on a show. Dave Kingman hit 3 home runs for the Cubs, 3 massive shots, 3 balls that traveled over 400 feet. Mike Schmidt hit 2 for the Phillies, 2 bombs of his own. On the surface, it looked like Kingman had won the duel. 3 home runs beats 2 home runs, right? But the box score reveals the crucial difference, the detail that separates a great performance from an empty one. Kingman's 3 home runs were prodigious. Yes, they were impressive, but his team lost. The Cubs lost 23-22 despite 3 home runs from their cleanup hitter. Schmidt's performance was complete. He had 4 walks and 4 RBI. He worked counts. He got on base when he did not hit a home run. And his second home run was the game-winning blast in the 10th inning off Hall of Famer Bruce Sutter, one of the best closers in baseball history. Schmidt came through in the clutch. He won the game. This is the narrative of their careers in miniature. Kingman's power was prodigious but empty. Schmidt's power was impactful, complete, and winning. Kingman's career saw him drift from team to team, 7 franchises in 16 years. San Francisco Giants, New York Mets, San Diego Padres, California Angels, New York Mets again, Chicago Cubs, Oakland A's. He could not stay anywhere. He was the ill-tempered one-dimensional journeyman, loyal to no one and with no one loyal to him. He burned every bridge he crossed. He alienated teammates like Bill Caudle and John Stearns. He defied managers like Yogi Berra and Frank Howard. He harassed reporters like Susan Fornoff. Mike Schmidt, by contrast, spent his entire 18-year career with one team, the Philadelphia Phillies, one city, one fan base, one organization. He became the greatest third baseman of all time. He was a 12-time All-Star, a 10-time Gold Glove winner, and a 3-time National League MVP. He was a first-ballot Hall of Famer, inducted in 1995, with 96.5% of the vote. The rivalry between Kingman and Schmidt was, in the end, no rivalry at all. It was never close. Schmidt was the standard of complete player excellence, and Kingman was the cautionary tale, the example of what happens when you have talent but no character. Let's look at the numbers side by side because numbers do not lie. Kingman finished with a career WAR of 17.3. WAR stands for wins above replacement, a statistic that measures a player's total value. Schmidt finished with 106.9. That is not a typo. Schmidt was worth almost 6 times as much to his teams as Kingman was to his. Kingman hit 442 home runs. Schmidt hit 548. Kingman hit 236 for his career. Schmidt hit 267. That might not seem like a huge difference, but over thousands of at-bats, it adds up to hundreds of extra hits. Kingman's on-base percentage was .302. Schmidt's was .380. That 78-point difference is massive. It means Schmidt got on base almost 80 more times per 1,000 plate appearances. Both struck out a lot. Kingman had 1,816 strikeouts. Schmidt had 1,883. So they were similar in that regard, both premier whiffers. But Schmidt's OPS plus was 148, meaning he was 48% better than the league average hitter after adjusting for park and era. Kingman's was 115, only 15% better. Schmidt was 3 times as valuable as Kingman by this metric. Kingman was a 3-time All-Star. Schmidt was a 12-time All-Star. His peers voted him in 12 times. Kingman won 0 Gold Gloves. Schmidt won 10. The atrocious fielder versus one of the greatest defensive third basemen who ever lived. Kingman never won an MVP award, though he finished in the top 25 5 times. Schmidt won 3 MVPs and finished in the top 10 8 times. That defines complete player excellence versus wasted talent. So let's recap the 7 pillars of Dave Kingman's toxic legacy. The 7 reasons why a man with 442 home runs is remembered as one of the most hated players in baseball history. First, Bill Caudle called him a cavity that made your whole mouth sore. A morale killer whose bad vibes infected every clubhouse he entered. His presence was not neutral, it was actively destructive. Second, John Stearns said he had the personality of a tree trunk, a communication void who only grunted and refused to engage with his teammates on any human level. Third, Yogi Berra and Frank Howard dealt with his insubordination when he threatened to bunt every time just to protest a managerial decision that was designed to help him succeed. He chose sabotage over adaptation. Fourth, Tommy Lasorda had a historic public meltdown after Kingman embarrassed his team, calling his performance bleeping horseshit because Kingman represented everything that was wrong with baseball's direction. Fifth, Mickey Hatcher had to deal with the chaos magnet who hit a ball into the Metrodome roof, literally breaking the rules of physics and forcing everyone around him into absurdity. Sixth, Susan Fornoff endured sustained harassment that culminated in Kingman sending her a live rat with a tag that said, "My name is Sue," an act of misogyny so blatant and cruel that it ended his career despite 35 home runs. And seventh, Mike Schmidt represented the ultimate contrast, a player with similar power who became a Hall of Famer because he was complete, disciplined, respected, and understood that baseball was more than just hitting home runs. Dave Kingman hit 442 home runs. That should have been enough to guarantee a legacy of respect, a plaque in Cooperstown, a place in history among the greats. But those 442 home runs became meaningless because of who he was, not what he did. His statistics are impressive. His character was abysmal. Talent without character is self-destruction. When asked for a final opinion on Dave Kingman's total performance, the most honest, accurate, and enduring answer remains Tommy Lasorda's. I think it was bleeping horseshit, and you know what? Lasorda was right. Because at the end of the day, baseball is not just about home runs. It is about respect. It is about teamwork. It is about being someone your teammates can count on, someone fans can admire, someone kids can look up to. Dave Kingman was none of those things. He was a cavity that made the whole mouth sore. He was a tree trunk with no personality. He was a chaos magnet who broke the rules and harassed women. And that is why, despite 442 home runs, his legacy is one of wasted talent and toxic behavior. Kingman hit 442 home runs, but he hit 0 moments of respect. If you think talent excuses toxicity, think again. Let us know below. Does Kingman deserve forgiveness, or did he earn every ounce of that hate? Don't forget to subscribe for more raw baseball history told without filters.
You know, I should have the whole incident should have never taken place, and you know, I'm glad that you know.
But as far as hating each other on the field, yeah.
Where's the bunt and gets it down nicely.
MLB legends have exposed the crimes of a wife-beater named Chuck Knoblauch, and at 57 years old, his legacy is forever defined by violence, scandal, and disgrace. Once celebrated as a 4-time World Series champion and Rookie of the Year, Knoblauch's story began with promise. He was a 4-time All-Star, a Gold Glove winner, and a cornerstone of championship teams. But that bright beginning makes his fall even more devastating. Knoblauch's career with the Minnesota Twins was legendary. He won Rookie of the Year in 1991, the same season he helped lift the Twins from last place to World Series champions. His sacrifice bunt in the 10th inning of Game 7 moved the winning run into scoring position. For 7 seasons, he dominated. He was selected to 4 All-Star games. He won 2 Silver Slugger Awards. He even claimed a Gold Glove in 1997. His statistics were staggering. From 1991 to 1997, he accumulated 38 wins above replacement, outpacing Hall of Famer Roberto Alomar, who had 31. During his absolute prime, from 1995 to 1997, Knoblauch's 22 WAR tied him with Ken Griffey Jr. for most in the American League. He batted .341 in 1996 and stole over 40 bases in 3 straight seasons. This was not just an all-star. This was an elite Hall of Fame caliber player. The Yankees traded a massive package of prospects for him in 1998, installing him as their leadoff hitter. He won 3 consecutive World Series championships with New York. In 1999, he scored 120 runs and hit 18 home runs. His bat was critical to their dynasty. Even as he celebrated championships, something was unraveling inside him. The collapse began with the yips. The yips are a mysterious syndrome where elite athletes suddenly lose the ability to perform basic skills. It's classified as a movement disorder, a neurological breakdown of fine motor skills. But under the pressure of professional sports, it becomes a psychological nightmare. Players tell themselves not to throw it in the dirt, and then they throw it right in the dirt. Knoblauch became the modern face of this affliction. Other players had suffered from it before, including pitcher Steve Blass and catcher Mackie Sasser, but Knoblauch's case was particularly noteworthy because it forced him to completely change positions. The irony is brutal. He arrived in New York in 1998 with the highest fielding percentage of any second baseman in MLB history who had played at least 1,000 games. He had just won the Gold Glove. Then it all fell apart. In 1998, his errors jumped to 13. In 1999, the yips fully consumed him. His throws to first base became wild and unpredictable. He committed a league-high 26 errors that season. In his first 3 years with the Yankees, he made 54 errors. To understand how catastrophic this was, consider that he had committed only 66 errors in his entire 7-year career with the Twins. He had gone from the most reliable defensive second baseman in baseball to the least reliable. June 15, 2000 was his breaking point. Against the Chicago White Sox, he made 3 throwing errors in just 6 innings. The last 2 led directly to Chicago runs. A month earlier, he had admitted to teammates he was at the breaking point. This game proved it. After his 3rd error, manager Joe Torre walked to the mound to change pitchers, while the rest of the Yankees infield gathered around. Knoblauch stood alone at second base, hands on hips, wallowing in his pain. When the inning ended, he returned to the dugout, spoke briefly to Torre, and then walked out. He left Yankee Stadium stadium in the middle of the game. It was a public surrender. 2 days later came the incident that turned his struggle into a national punchline. On June 17, 2000, Knoblauch fielded a ground ball. His throw to first was inexplicable. A wild sailing missile that flew over the first baseman's head, bounced off the dugout roof, and shot into the stands. The ball struck a fan sitting behind the dugout. That fan was Kay Olbermann, mother of prominent sportscaster Keith Olbermann. Keith himself had to report the incident on air, wryly noting that Chuck Knoblauch's throwing problem was getting personal, as the ball had hit his mother. The event moved Knoblauch's yips from the sports pages into pop culture infamy. The Yankees could no longer risk his scatter arm at second base. He was relegated to left field and designated hitter for his final seasons. This effectively ended his elite status. He played one unremarkable season with Kansas City in 2002 and was out of baseball by 2003. A psychological affliction he could not overcome had destroyed his career. But the collapse created more than just statistical problems. It fractured the clubhouse. The most significant legend to publicly expose Knoblauch's struggles was Yankees owner George Steinbrenner. The boss was not known for patience. In 2000, Steinbrenner told the media he was not as diplomatic as Joe Torre. He issued a public warning that the Yankees would not go far if Knoblauch and another struggling player didn't get straightened out. Knoblauch, in a rare move for a player, openly fired back at Steinbrenner in the media. This public feud placed immense pressure on the entire organization. The yips turned the Yankees clubhouse into a media circus. ESPN's Buster Olney described the scene as a total wild card. Reporters were forced to stake out Knoblauch's locker every day, uncertain if he would speak at all. Olney described it as heartbreaking to watch, as a former Gold Glover melted down day by day, but it also created a toxic environment. Reporters felt like someone watching an accident on the highway. This constant, intense external pressure inevitably inflamed internal clubhouse friction. There was tension with reliever Jeff Nelson, reportedly fueled by Knoblauch complaining about Nelson's pitching in a game. But this tension was balanced by public declarations of support from team captain Derek Jeter. As fans and media intensified their criticism, Jeter took a public stand. He stated they were not winning without Chuck, demanding fans support his teammate. This split dynamic defined the clubhouse. The team was forced to publicly support Knoblauch because his bat was essential to their dynasty, but the fragility of his mental state and the accidents on the field created undeniable strain. If you're enjoying this deep dive into one of baseball's most complicated legacies, drop a comment below. Do you think the yips were the beginning of his downfall or just a symptom of deeper problems? Let me know what you think. While the yips ended his career, it is his off-field conduct that defines his legacy today. The reference to crimes in the plural is not an exaggeration. An investigation into his post-career life reveals a clear, multi-year documented pattern of escalating violence and aggression. On September 29, 2009, Knoblauch was arrested and charged with felony domestic violence for assaulting his common-law wife, Stacy Stelmach. Stelmach reported to police that they had an argument, and when she tried to take his car keys because she believed he was intoxicated, he punched and choked her. On March 16, 2010, this incident moved from allegation to fact when Knoblauch pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor assault charge. This was a criminal conviction. He received deferred adjudication probation for 1 year and was fined $1,000. His only public comment was a brief apology. The 2010 conviction was not an isolated wake-up call. In March 2014, just 2 months after the Minnesota Twins announced his election to their Hall of Fame, Knoblauch had another run-in with the law. On March 12, 2014, he was charged with interference with public duties. The allegation was that he had pushed a police officer. This incident was still outstanding when he was arrested again in July. It demonstrated a pattern of aggression that was not limited to domestic partners and was clearly escalating. July 24, 2014 was the incident that destroyed his legacy permanently. Just 1 month before his scheduled induction into the Twins Hall of Fame, Knoblauch was arrested again. He was charged with the assault of his ex-wife, Sherry Knoblauch. Police were dispatched to a domestic disturbance call at 3:49 in the morning. When officers arrived, they noted that Knoblauch appeared to be intoxicated. The details of the police report were violent and specific. Sherry Knoblauch told police her ex-husband had become upset that she was sleeping in another bedroom with her child. He allegedly grabbed her and smashed her head against a wall. He was also accused of hitting her in the arm and chest and throwing a humidifier at her as she fled the room. This was not a case of conflicting accounts. Officers at the scene observed and reported visible injuries on Sherry Knoblauch, including a large bruise on her arm, a larger scratch on the left side of her face, and a knot on her forehead. These were the recent news reports that forced the Minnesota Twins organization to act. The most powerful exposure of Chuck Knoblauch's crimes did not come from a single legend or teammate. It came from the very institution that built his legend in the first place. In January 2014, Knoblauch's redemption arc seemed complete. He had been elected by a 62-member panel to be the 27th member of the Minnesota Twins Hall of Fame. The induction ceremony was scheduled for August 23, 2014 at Target Field. This was to be his first official return to the organization since his bitter trade. A crucial point must be understood. The Minnesota Twins organization knew about Knoblauch's 2010 guilty plea for assault when they elected him. Twins president Dave St. Peter confirmed this, stating that Knoblauch was prepared to handle questions about his past and address the media when he returned to Minnesota. The organization was willing to overlook one conviction as a past mistake. The July 2014 assault on Sherry Knoblauch, however, was unforgivable. The arrest, which occurred just weeks before his scheduled ceremony and brought to light the March 2014 arrest for pushing an officer, demonstrated a clear, undeniable pattern of violence. It made his position as an organizational legend untenable. The Twins' reaction was swift, public, and decisive. Within hours of the news, the team released an official statement canceling the Hall of Fame induction ceremony. This was the institutional exposure in its most powerful form. Dave St. Peter's follow-up comments to the media were even more damning. He articulated a new standard for his organization, stating that off-field elements are equally important relative to the franchise's brand and the reality that players and former players are role models. This was the organization that drafted him, won a World Series with him, and was prepared to forgive his bitter trade demand. For that institution to so publicly and permanently disavow him was the definitive verdict on his character. St. Peter confirmed the cancellation was final, stating there were no plans to reschedule the induction. The unprecedented nature of this decision cannot be overstated. Organizations rarely cancel Hall of Fame inductions. The fact that the Twins took this step speaks volumes about the severity of Knoblauch's actions and the pattern of behavior they revealed. It was not just one mistake. It was a repeated, documented history of violence against women that the organization could no longer ignore or excuse. The timing of the cancellation also matters. The organization had already printed programs, sold tickets, and prepared for the ceremony. Fans had made travel arrangements. Former teammates were scheduled to attend. Canceling an event of this magnitude so close to the date required extraordinary circumstances. The Twins were willing to absorb the logistical and financial costs because the alternative was morally unacceptable. Honoring a man with a pattern of domestic violence would have sent a terrible message to fans, sponsors, and the community. Knoblauch's actions also made him a pariah among some peers. Former MLB player Milton Bradley, while discussing domestic violence, used Knoblauch as an example, stating bluntly that he's a horrible human being. This comment from a fellow player reflects the broader sentiment that Knoblauch's off-field actions had erased any remaining goodwill from his playing days. Compounding the yips and the pattern of violence is a third distinct crime that taints his on-field legacy: the use of performance-enhancing drugs. On December 13, 2007, Chuck Knoblauch was officially named in the Mitchell Report, a comprehensive investigation commissioned by MLB into the use of steroids and other performance-enhancing drugs in baseball. The allegation against Knoblauch came from trainer Brian McNamee, the same personal trainer who was the central witness against Yankees teammates Roger Clemens and Andy Petita. McNamee's testimony was provided to Senator George Mitchell under threat of federal prosecution. It was highly specific. He testified that he obtained illegal human growth hormone and injected Knoblauch at least 7 to 9 times. McNamee stated that these injections began during spring training of the 2001 season and continued through the early part of that year. Unlike Clemens and other players who vehemently denied the report's findings, Knoblauch's response was different. While he initially expressed bewilderment at his inclusion in the report, his official response was far more damaging. On February 1, 2008, Knoblauch voluntarily met with the House Oversight Committee holding hearings on the Mitchell Report. In that meeting, he provided a stunning admission. According to the committee's official summary, Knoblauch told them that McNamee was accurate when he told Senator Mitchell that McNamee had injected him with human growth hormone. Knoblauch's admission was a confirmation of his ethical collapse. He attempted to justify his HGH use, claiming he had never done steroids, but that HGH was different. Tried to frame it as a recovery tool, arguing that the Yankees' grueling night game schedule meant getting to the next town at 4 or 5 in the morning, causing players to get run down and sick. The HGH, he claimed, was just a little bit of a boost, like taking vitamins. This admission placed his 2001 season and his entire career in a new light. It is bitterly ironic that his HGH use in 2001 coincided with the absolute nadir of his yips and the end of his career. Knoblauch himself later offered a hollow, self-serving epitaph for this ethical failure, admitting he did HGH but that it didn't help him out, didn't make him any better, and that he had the worst years of his career. It was not performance-enhancing for him. At age 57, the legacy of Chuck Knoblauch is complete and settled. The 3 primary narratives of his public life are no longer separate. They are fully synthesized into a single, comprehensive story of a 3-act fall. Act 1 was the on-field legend from 1991 to 1997, a Hall of Fame caliber trajectory as a World Series champion and Rookie of the Year. Act 2 was the public collapse from 1998 to 2001, where the yips and the surreal incident involving Kay Olbermann made him a national spectacle and symbol of psychological failure. Act 3 was the criminal pariah from 2009 to present, marked by the ethical collapse of his HGH admission and most significantly the moral collapse of his documented pattern of criminal violence. The final verdict on this legacy, the ultimate exposure, came from police reports detailing his violence, from congressional testimony confirming his drug use, and most powerfully from the very institution that raised him. The Minnesota Twins' 2014 cancellation of his Hall of Fame induction was the final institutional verdict. Their explicit statement that off-field elements and the responsibilities of being a role model are equally important to on-field accomplishments was the gavel striking down on his entire career. As we close this chapter on Chuck Knoblauch's Knoblauch's story, there's an important lesson in institutional accountability. The Twins' decision to cancel his Hall of Fame induction represents progress in how we hold athletes responsible for their actions beyond the field. It reflects a growing awareness that domestic violence is never acceptable, regardless of someone's athletic achievements. Organizations are finally prioritizing the safety and dignity of victims over the glorification of abusers. That standard matters. It sends a message that talent does not excuse cruelty and championships do not erase crimes. If you think organizations like the Twins should permanently erase players with violent histories from their honors, or if you believe in redemption and second chances, drop your thoughts in the comments below. This conversation matters.
Nolan Ryan, after striking out 12, struck Willie Wilson with a pitch. Nolan was ejected for the first time in his 26-year...
RBI single in the first. Watch out.
Look at this. MLB legends who hated Nolan Ryan weren't just bitter rivals, they were victims of one of baseball's most calculated intimidation campaigns. Everyone remembers the strikeouts and no-hitters, but what they forget is the feuds, the brawls, and the fear he weaponized to hide his flaws. This is the story of how the Ryan Express left a trail of enemies in his wake. Nolan Ryan was a legend. 5,714 strikeouts, 7 no-hitters, 27 seasons of dominance. Players who faced him were scared to death, even decades after retirement. The documentary Facing Nolan captured this perfectly. Former players, safe in retirement and far removed from their playing days, still spoke of him with a tremor in their voices. They admitted they were terrified every time they stepped into the box against him. But behind that golden image was something darker, a fiery personality that sparked unforgettable rivalries and bitter enemies. Ryan didn't just beat hitters with his fastball, he beat them with intimidation, confrontation, and a carefully crafted aura of violence. In September 1990, Bo Jackson hit a line drive that smashed into Ryan's face, splitting his lip open. Ryan didn't leave the game. He threw Jackson out at first, then pitched another 17 outs with blood streaming down his uniform. It wasn't just toughness, it was theater. It was a performance of intimidation. It cemented the myth that Ryan was indestructible. But that image came at a cost, and it left a lot of players hating him for it. This was the foundation of his persona. Violence and confrontation weren't accidents. They were tools. The most iconic moment of Ryan's dark side happened on August 4th, 1993. Robin Ventura, a 26-year-old star for the Chicago White Sox, charged the mound after Ryan drilled him with a pitch. What followed wasn't a fair fight. It was a beating. Ryan, 46 years old, grabbed Ventura in a headlock and landed 5 or 6 punches to his head before the benches cleared. The image of the old veteran pummeling the young star became instant legend. Ventura was ejected and later suspended for 2 games. Ryan? He wasn't even thrown out of the game. The umpire said Ryan had the right to defend himself. After the brawl, Ryan stayed in and picked off Ventura's replacement from first base. It was the ultimate power move. But here's the truth nobody talks about. That fight wasn't some spontaneous clash. It was the boiling point of a multi-season beanball war between the Texas Rangers and the Chicago White Sox. The animosity between these teams had been building for years. Earlier in that very game, Ventura had laced an RBI single off Ryan in the first inning. When Ventura came up again, Ryan hit him in the arm. To anyone paying attention, it was obvious retaliation. Ventura knew it was intentional. He took a few steps toward first, threw his helmet to the ground, and charged. The fight that followed was incredibly one-sided. Ryan immediately locked him in a headlock and just pounded away. Ventura said it best after the game. If you don't think he did it on purpose, you don't know the game. He dismissed Ryan's punches as just a couple of noogies trying to save face after being made the fool. Ryan, of course, claimed it was just self-preservation. He said he was just trying to pitch inside and had nothing against Robin Ventura. But everyone knew better. The incident cemented Ryan's status as an untouchable folk hero. He was perceived as a man who could dominate hitters with his arm and physically vanquish them with his fists, all while operating under a different set of rules than his opponents. The aftermath told the real story. Decades later, when producers for the Facing Nolan documentary reached out to Ventura for an interview, he declined. The hate never went away, and here's the twist nobody remembers. The public image of that brawl is a lie. Ryan didn't walk away a conquering hero. He nearly died. Bo Jackson, Ventura's teammate, was involved before, during, and after the fight. Jackson suspected Ryan might hit Ventura as payback for the RBI single. He gave Ventura 2 pieces of advice. Keep your helmet on for protection, and use the slope of the mound to get leverage. Ventura ignored both. He flipped his helmet off as he charged. Jackson even yelled at him to keep it on, but it was too late. What happened next is the part that shatters the myth. After Ryan landed his punches, the benches cleared. A massive pile formed. Ryan ended up on the bottom, suffocating under the weight of bodies. He couldn't breathe. He thought he was going to black out and die. Then 2 big arms started tossing players off him. It was Bo Jackson. In Ryan's own biography, Nolan Ryan, The Making of a Pitcher, he admitted the truth. "All I remember is that I couldn't breathe," Ryan stated. "I thought I was going to black out and die, when all of a sudden I see two big arms tossing bodies off of me. It was Bo Jackson. He had come to my rescue, and I'm awful glad he did, because I was about to pass out." Ryan was so grateful he called Jackson that night to thank him. He later told Jackson he had saved his life. So the cornerstone of Ryan's tough guy legacy, the moment that supposedly proved he was indestructible, was actually the moment he was rendered helpless and nearly unconscious, and he was saved by an opposing player. Bo Jackson advised Ventura on how to win the fight, then physically saved Ryan from the consequences of it. The irony is almost too perfect. But that headlock wasn't instinct. It was a strategy Ryan had been holding onto for 13 years. On August 4th, 1980, exactly 13 years to the day before the Ventura Brawl, Ryan faced Dave Winfield. Ryan was throwing high and inside, playing some ear-splitting chin music. He brushed Winfield back twice, then knocked him to the ground with a 100-mile-per-hour beanball. Winfield, a mountain of a man at 6'6" and 220 pounds, had enough. He charged with pure conviction, shoved off both the catcher and the umpire, and got to Ryan. This time, Ryan would not fare so well. Winfield took a big swing and swatted Ryan in the back of the head with a huge overhand right. Ryan tried a makeshift headlock, but it wasn't the dominant maneuver seen in 1993. Winfield was still trying to get little punches in from the bottom of the pile. Winfield was ejected, but the lesson was learned. Many people don't know that Dave Winfield gave Nolan a beating after a hit by pitch, and Nolan promised himself that he would be ready next time someone charged the mound. Ryan later confirmed that the Winfield brawl taught him to defend himself. So the Ventura headlock wasn't self-preservation. It was a rehearsed defensive tactic, developed and held in reserve for 13 years, waiting for the next man to charge. Ryan, having been physically beaten by a superior athlete in Winfield, had perfected a new response. Robin Ventura was simply the first person to test that calculated strategy. If you're loving this deep dive into baseball's hidden rivalries, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me which MLB feud you want covered next. Did Ventura have it coming, or was Ryan out of line? Not all of Ryan's feuds were violent. His feud with Will Clark was a cold war, born from Ryan's inability to dominate an opponent who showed him no fear from day one. On April 8, 1986, Will Clark, a 22-year-old rookie, stepped into the batter's box for his first ever major league at-bat. The pitcher was Nolan Ryan. On his very first swing in the big leagues, Clark hit a high fastball into the center field seats of the Astrodome for a home run. It was the ultimate act of defiance against baseball's greatest intimidator. Clark even turned to his teammate Chili Davis in the dugout and asked, "He's going to drill me next time, isn't he?" That first swing wasn't a fluke. It was a preview of the entire relationship. In 39 plate appearances against Ryan, Clark hit 6 home runs and posted a staggering 1.274 OPS. He owned Nolan Ryan. For a man whose entire persona was built on fear, Clark's persistent dominance was an unforgivable sin. The hate here wasn't fiery. It was frigid. Years later, when Clark signed with the Texas Rangers, the organization Ryan was synonymous with, you'd think they could laugh about their shared history. According to Clark, the opposite was true. "He never would once talk to me," Clark stated in a 2016 interview. "He avoided me like the plague." That's the old school mentality. Hitters and pitchers. I completely understood it. Clark's polite understanding masks the reality. Ryan's refusal to even acknowledge his former rival and current team's first baseman was a deep personal grudge. When faced with a rival he could not physically intimidate like Ventura or beat with his stuff, Ryan's negative response was to simply pretend he did not exist. The thrill had exposed a crack in the Ryan facade. The Ryan Express had no answer for Will Clark, and Ryan's ego couldn't handle it. This dynamic of fear and dominance defined Ryan's relationships with other legends too. George Brett had the most hits off Ryan of any batter, 29 in 115 plate appearances. Brett was proud of his .287 average against the legend, but despite his success, Brett feared him. Of Brett's 317 career home runs, not a single one came off Nolan Ryan. When asked why he never took Ryan deep, Brett gave a chillingly practical answer, joking or not, "I saw what happened to Robin Ventura. That didn't look comfortable." This admission is profound. Ryan's cultivated aura of violence, learned from his 1980 defeat by Winfield and perfected on Ventura in 1993, was a tangible strategic weapon. It was so potent it successfully neutralized the power of one of his greatest and most successful rivals. The fear of Nolan Ryan was as effective as his fastball. Pete Rose was one of the toughest hitters Ryan ever faced. Ryan respected him, saying Pete was one of the toughest hitters I ever had to face. It was never easy when he came to the plate. While they shared mutual respect, their on-field battles were intense. On June 10, 1981, Rose entered the game needing 2 hits to pass Stan Musial's all-time National League hits record. The stadium was packed to see the record broken. Ryan's take? They didn't come to see Nolan Ryan pitch. They came to see Rose break the record. Off Nolan Ryan. Rose singled in his first at-bat, tying the record. The stage was set for history. What followed was a deliberate act of competitive animosity. Rose himself told the story. Nolan Ryan just said to himself, "This guy's not going to beat the record off me." He struck me out the next 3 times up. Ryan froze him on a curveball that Rose later admitted, "I couldn't hit." Because of Ryan's dominance and the ensuing player strike, Rose had to wait 56 days to finally break the record. This was the nature of their feud. It was captured perfectly in a story Ryan told about the 1980 playoffs. Rose saw Ryan in batting practice and yelled, "I wish you'd get that curveball of yours over just 1 time, because I'm going to hit it right off your blanking forehead." In the game, Ryan threw the curve. Rose hit a vicious line drive that Ryan barely gloved. As Rose ran to first, he was pointing directly at Ryan. The mutual respect was real, but so was the desire to destroy each other on the field. Dave Winfield, despite winning their 1980 brawl, hit just 103 against Ryan over 41 plate appearances. Ryan's statistical dominance over Winfield in the batter's box was complete, but Winfield won the fight that mattered. He forced Ryan to be ready next time, which directly led to the Ventura incident 13 years later. This legacy of fear and feuds served a specific purpose. It was a necessary shield to mask significant statistical vulnerabilities. While many call Ryan a top 2 or top 3 all-time pitcher, a sober statistical analysis suggests it's questionable if he's even in the top 10. The hagiography ignores the glaring holes in his resume. He famously never won a Cy Young Award, and for all his positive records, he holds negative ones of equal magnitude. He is the all-time leader in walks and ranks 3rd all-time in losses. His reputation for dominance is built on his #1 all-time hits per 9 innings rate, the foundation for his 7 no-hitters. But when his insane rate of walks is factored in, his career WHIP, walks plus hits per inning pitched, plummets to 266th all-time. That's not the mark of a top 3 pitcher. That's the mark of a deeply flawed one. The most damning piece of negative evidence comes from advanced metrics. A statistical dive into his performance reveals that Ryan was a dramatically worse pitcher, about 11% worse, with men on base. His performance cratered when he was forced to pitch from the stretch, a situation that likely exacerbated his legendary control problems. This is a devastating indictment. It means that when the game was on the line, when runners were in scoring position, when his team needed him most, Nolan Ryan got significantly worse. Think about what that means. All the intimidation, all the brushback pitches, all the hit batters, all the feuds, they served a purpose. They kept hitters uncomfortable. They kept them from getting on base in the first place. Because once they did, Ryan was vulnerable. His fastball was still electric, but his control vanished. The walks piled up, the pressure mounted, and suddenly the legend looked human. This is the grand, unifying theory of Nolan Ryan's negative angle. His entire persona, the intimidation, the retaliatory hit by pitch, the bloody lip performance against Bo Jackson, and the carefully crafted reputation as a brawler was a necessary psychological weapon. It was not just a byproduct of a fiery personality, it was a brilliant career-long compensation mechanism for his greatest flaw. Ryan cultivated an aura of fear so that hitters like George Brett would be less comfortable, less aggressive, and less likely to stand in against him. He intimidated them in the dugout before they even reached the batter's box, because he knew that once they got on base, he was a demonstrably weaker and more vulnerable pitcher. The hate and fear he generated weren't side effects of his greatness. They were essential ingredients for it. This folk hero was a master of psychological warfare, using a violent, intimidating persona to protect his flawed and perhaps overrated statistical reality. The rivalries weren't accidents. The feuds weren't unfortunate byproducts of competition. They were intentional. They were strategic. They were necessary. Without them, the cracks in his game would have been too obvious to ignore. The walks, the losses, the lack of a Cy Young, the collapse with runners on base, all of it would have defined him differently. But instead, we remember the fights. We remember the headlock. We remember the bloody lip. We remember the fear in the eyes of Hall of Famers. And maybe that's exactly what Nolan Ryan wanted. Because if hitters were too busy being afraid to notice he couldn't throw strikes with men on base, then the intimidation had done its job. The psychological edge became his greatest pitch, more effective than any fastball or curveball he ever threw. At the end of the day, love him or hate him, Nolan Ryan remains one of baseball's most unforgettable figures. His legacy isn't just about strikeouts. It's about the enemies he made along the way. It's about the fear he created. It's about the psychological warfare that turned a statistically flawed pitcher into a legend. And it's about the truth that behind every great myth, there's usually a more complicated reality. If this story opened your eyes to the darker side of baseball history, make sure you're subscribed and drop your thoughts in the comments. Who do you think really won the battle between Ryan and his rivals? Was he a genius who maximized every advantage? Or was he just a bully who hid behind intimidation?